Projective identification, highly complex concept. Today I will provide a rudimentary account of the concept and try to explain why I think that it should not be used by psychoanalysts. So where do we start? Melanie Klein originally coined the term in 1946 in her paper Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms. According to Klein, projective identification is a psychological process that is relevant to the early paranoid schizoid position in the development of an infant. Now, while being in this position, what we may call bad parts of the self are sometimes split off and projected onto another person in an effort to protect the self. For example, an infant's aggressive, self-destructive urges will be projected onto the mother and attributed to the mother. Now, two things are important to note about Klein's notion of projective identification. The first, and this is crucially important, Klein does not argue in any way that the aggressive urges the infant projects are actually transferred to the mother herself. According to Klein, they remain part of the infant's view of the mother. 2. Klein argues that the confusional states, such as projective identification, normally disappear after working through the depressive position in the second half of the first year of the life of an infant. Now, this means that for Klein, projective identification remains relevant only to psychotic adults and is not so relevant to neurotic adults. Up to now, everything is good. And while it seems that Klein's theory doesn't really add anything new to Freud's account of projection in cases of paranoia, she does actually attribute it to a specific position an infant takes in the first months of his or her life and remains consistent when doing so. However, things change drastically with Wilfred Bion, who was very much involved with the development of the concept of projective identification. Well, he goes beyond Klein in many ways, making projective identification one of the most important forms of interaction between analyst and analysand. This development is based on a crucial theoretical leap in which one does not describe projective identification in terms of the fantasy in the mind of the infant, but as an actual manipulation of the parent's being, through which an actual psychic element is inserted into the mind of the parent. This is a transmission of aggression, for example, that actually turns the mother into an aggressive mother. Now, in terms of the process of psychoanalysis, Bion suggests that analysts function as a container, a repository for the analysand's projections. That is sort of a passive object into which the analysand can choose to entrust anything he or she sees fit. Now, during training analysis, the analyst has to acquire a strong enough personality to contain these projections and integrate them. And by identifying with the analyst, these integrated projections are made safe for their investigation and re-internalization by the analysand. It is a known fact that most humans are attentive to the affective states of others. We normally share the joy of a good friend, or we cry at the sign of the hardship of a loved one. This is what we call empathy, an attempt to understand and share the feelings of others. However, there is a clear distinction between the analyst's capacity to empathize with his or her analysand and what is sometimes called in science fiction an empath. Now, if you're savvy with the sci-fi jargon, which I very much appreciate, an empath is a person with the paranormal ability to directly perceive the mental or emotional states of others. In the terrific sci-fi show called Star Trek: The Next Generation, we have a excellent example for that, the Starship Enterprise luckily has hired an empath as a psychological counselor. This is Counselor Troy. But Freud, which distinguished the science of psychoanalysis from the fiction, had directly noted that whatever information the analyst receives from his or her analysand has to be mediated in one way or another. Being the talking cure, in psychoanalysis, this mediating form is language. Now, it seems to me that what is today commonly described as projective identification relies more on the notion of an empath rather than of empathy, on what psychoanalyst René Spitz called a quasi-telepathic communication of ideas, or in other words, the notion of a message with no medium. Now, one can argue that language is not always spoken, and in a way, this is true. We also communicate with others using body language. It is common to feel stressed while you're in the same room with a person that keeps shaking his leg, or yawn when another person is yawning. But other than in very limited cases, none of these non-verbal forms of communication entail the immediate transmission of knowledge from one person to another. In a limited amount of cases, they might entail a very simple reaction, like what is called yawning contagion. But any attribution of a more complex meaning to these non-verbal forms of communication requires an interpretation that is based on one's perspective and a set of previously agreed upon cultural and symbolic circumstances. So, even when considered on the level of non-verbal communication, projective identification cannot be said to transmit any form of knowledge that could be useful for the progress of an analysis. Let's get back to empathy. So, empathy entails a conscious and intentional shift in perspective that is done in the aim of understanding the thoughts, feelings, decisions, and so on that someone experiences under certain circumstances. But many empathy scholars differentiate between two types of empathy: an in his shoes type of perspective shifting and a more empathic form of perspective shifting. The first entails shifting your perspective and imagining what thoughts, feelings, decisions, and so on you would arrive at if you were in the other's circumstances. So we see that in this form of empathy, you bring in your own baggage and you weigh the circumstances using your own set of biases. In this sense, when the situation is simple, you might hit the right spot when trying to guess what the other person is thinking. The Sally-Ann test is a famous psychological test that attempts to measure such empathic success in very simple circumstances. Now, when the circumstances one faces become more difficult and complex, this kind of empathy usually fails in predicting the behavior and actions of other people. The second type of empathy entails something else. It entails imagining being the other person and thereby actually sharing in his or her thoughts, feelings, decisions, and other aspects of their psychology. I would like to argue that not only is this form of empathy impossible to perform, that is, no one can actually be an other person and know what they are thinking, anyone claiming to do so would necessarily have to usurp the other's subjectivity and force their own subjective outlook onto the other. Accordingly, even if we consider projective identification as being based on the analyst's empathy, when we associate it with perspective shifting empathy, we cannot assume that it entails an empathic access to the perspective of the other. In the worst cases, an analysis based on an empathic form of perspective shifting will force on the analysand the contours of the personality and experience of the analyst, replicating the analyst's person in the analysand, crushing the latter's subjectivity and singular mode of desiring. It might, at the best of cases, entail an in-his-shoes form of perspective shifting, which will not provide direct access to the analysant's thoughts and might be the basis for a lucky guess here and there on matters that are extremely simplistic and not so subjective. Most of the time, it will lead to what Jacques Lacan calls judgments that are based on the sum total of the analyst's biases, passions, and difficulties, and even of his inadequate information at any given moment in the dialectical process. This, Lacan says, is the price of using countertransference in directing the treatment. It leads to a wild analysis. What is even more puzzling about the contemporary notion of projective identification is that it is said to transmit unconscious knowledge that is unknown to the analysant in any way. In other words, projective identification is said to entail a transmission of unconscious knowledge that the patient itself does not know. Now, this argument goes beyond the quasi-telepathy model, as this model at least entails a certain active communication on behalf of the analysant. What do we have here other than a communication of a non-knowledge, an absence that presumably is captured by no medium? It seems to me that whatever analyst thinks they pick up in the psychoanalytic ether should probably be chopped up to forcing the analyst's countertransference onto the analysant's transference. So what are we left with? Well, we're left with Klein's notion of projective identification that doesn't go much further than Freud's account of projection in cases of psychosis. Otherwise, we're left with a notion that basically betrays the scientific rigor of Freud's psychoanalysis on so many levels. All in all, it seems that the contemporary proponents of projective identification have the responsibility of answering a few questions before we can take them seriously. For instance, how can complex emotions and thoughts be split off from the psyche of one person and projected into another's in a quasi-telepathic way? Also, how can these thoughts and emotions be interpreted by the analyst in a non-mediated way and then transposed back to the analysant? And finally, how can we make sure that directing an analysis on the basis of these feelings felt by the analyst is not only a dangerous practice of wishful thinking? Well, with the lack of good answers to these questions, I'm afraid that projective identification remains in the domain of magical thinking that Freud associated with the infantile psyche and the ceremonies and rituals of theological and primal origin. Accordingly, until we've provided convincing answers, I suggest that analysts should not presume to think what the analysant is thinking, or even argue that they should be feeling or wanting to feel it. It would be preferable to be interested in the analysant's speech, suspending their judgment, and putting their own perspective and understanding at rest.